Welcome everybody once again to our virtual church service here at Maynard Community Baptist. And I as much as anyone would like to see this virtual church service ended and our normative gathering once again resumed, but that's just not where we are right now. And so for the foreseeable future, we're going to continue to do this. I have prayed this morning for you all and for the needs of the church. I hope that if there were any other prayer requests, I didn't see anything in my inbox this morning in my phone that told me that someone had something specific, but I hope that everything that was in your file of needs was prayed for today. And if not, if you are concerned about that, please feel free to text me at any point or call me, and I'll be sure and incorporate your particular needs in the prayers that I offer to God. I want to take a look at a text today that has to do again with Jesus standing before Pilate. Pilate is an interesting character. As we spoke of him last week, you'll notice something about Pilate. Pilate is a very reluctant enforcer of the law here. He does not want to execute Jesus because he sees nothing in Jesus's doings that would rise to the level of a capital crime. And so he's not at all trying to see Jesus executed. In fact, he's really an advocate in some ways for Jesus. He's at very least neutral here. And so what I'd like to do today is, as we look at this in Pilate's moment of living, wherein he's having to encounter Jesus in this way, let's see what lessons we can take away from it as we study this text together. So if you have a Bible and you like to follow along, please turn in it to Luke chapter 23. Luke chapter 23, and I'll begin reading, and you can read along with me if you like, in verse 13. Then Pilate called together the chief priests, the rulers, the scribes, and the people. And he said to them, "You brought me this man as one who was misleading the people. When I examined him before you, I did not find him guilty of anything of which you had accused him. Neither did Herod, for Herod sent him back to us. Now look, he's done nothing here deserving of death. I will therefore have him flogged, and I will release him." They all shouted together, "Take this man away, release Barabbas for us." This man, Barabbas, had been thrown into prison for an insurrection started in the city and for murder. Pilate addressed them once again that he wanted to release Jesus, but they shouted louder, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" A third time Pilate said, "What? Why? What has he done that is so wrong? I have found him guilty of no crime deserving death. Therefore I'll flog him and release him." But they were insistent, demanding with loud shouts that Jesus be crucified, and their shouts prevailed upon Pilate. Therefore Pilate decided that their demand should be granted. He released the man that they had asked for, Barabbas, who had been thrown into prison for insurrection and murder, but he handed Jesus over to their will. Pilate is torn between some very incongruent desires. We live in a nation that holds liberty and law together, two polar opposite things. Liberty, the freedom to do whatever, and the law that restricts that freedom. And yet we hold those things together in our structure, in our country, as things that are needful to hold together. Well, Pilate here is torn between two completely incongruent desires. One is he wants to see Roman justice, which was supposedly impartial, just as ours is impartial. Now, of course, any justice system incorporating human beings can be corrupted, and the Roman system was no exception. If you go back and read in Roman history, you read the conflict between the plebes and the elites, and you see that the Roman justice system had been corrupted and needed correction. And you see the whole history of the 12 tables and all of the things that were really the first actual written down codified constitution that we're aware of in history came out of that, because the Roman system had been corrupted. But no matter how detailed the codification is of a legal system, it can be corrupted because humans are involved. Humans have feelings. Humans have desires. And when those desires come in conflict with the law and its impartiality, then corruption ensues. And the Roman Empire is no exception. However, the Roman civil magistrates were steeped in this idea of Roman justice and its impartiality. And so Pilate very zealously wants to protect that here. He wants to be a good Roman impartial judge as he adjudicates this case involving Jesus. So one of the glories of Rome is on his mind, that idea of the impartial jurisprudence that he wants to maintain as he examines Jesus. The other pole of Pilate's conflict is he wants to stay in office. Now that's a big one. That's one where we see Pilate being kind of like a modern in some ways, because he knows that if he allows this episode to escalate into a riot, Rome's going to find out about it, and very likely Pilate will be removed from office. He doesn't want to do that. He knows that his political future in Rome as a ruler rests on how well or how poorly he adjudicates this particular case. Now Pilate in this instance makes fully four attempts that I could count, in which he attempts to release Jesus on the basis that he sees nothing to charge him with. In John 19, he tells them explicitly, if you go back and read the parallel account in John in chapter 19, he tells them to settle this matter yourselves. This is a religious matter. I don't have any axe to grind here. I don't care about your religious upset. I don't care about whether or not Jesus has blasphemed this God in whom I don't believe. I mean, he's not interested in that. However, he is very interested in things like insurrection. So that's why the Jewish mob brought that up. They said, look, we're not satisfied with your answer regarding Jesus, so we're going to bring up a charge that you have to pay attention to. So he tells them to settle the matter themselves. That's the first attempt that Pilate makes to get rid of this whole thing. Doesn't work. The mob's not satisfied. Then he refers the case back to Herod. That seems like a good way to go. Let's send Jesus back to the Jewish under-magistrate who's under the Roman thumb, but has some power in adjudicating such things. And Herod had some acquaintance with Judaism, and so some of these things might make more sense to Herod. So Pilate says, I'm sending you back to Herod. He goes to Herod. Jesus won't even speak in his own defense before Herod. He's silent. And of course, Herod is just exasperated with that. Herod was looking for dinner and a show. He wanted to see Jesus do some kind of miracle. Herod is not satisfied with what happens, so he ships Jesus back to Pilate. So that's two attempts now wherein there's been an attempt to set Jesus free. The third attempt is he tries to get Jesus released as the Passover release. The Romans did have a practice. I looked into this. There is an historical practice in which the Romans would release a prisoner as long as it wasn't a capital crime against Rome. They would release a prisoner under the request of the group of people who came to petition for that prisoner's release. And so here we are, the Jewish feast of Passover, the biggest feast of all the year, and Pilate is trying to be that welcoming, accommodating Roman official toward the Jews and says, look, I'll release him for Passover. They're not satisfied with that. So that's three attempts. Fourth attempt, he tries to have Jesus punished. Now, this punishment is severe. This is not just, I'll hold him in a cell for 3 days without food and water and then I'll let him go. This is a kind of punishment where Jesus could have likely died just from the beating. And lots of people did. The beating, as you well know, if you've looked into this, if you've been a believer for any length of time, you're aware of the cat of nine tails, the whip that was used by the lictor, the Roman person who was educated in how to beat people to within an inch of their lives. And some people were intentionally beaten to death. The 40th lash was the one that was supposed to beat you to death. 39 lashes was the one that was supposed to bring you up to death and then leave you alive to suffer the consequences as punishment, but not capital punishment. Well, lots of people died from the less than capital punishment because this whip, with all of its little pieces of bone and metal on the ends, started to tear away the flesh. And there were records, Roman records, of people's entrails falling out. Now, we're at a time in history when you really couldn't do anything about that surgically. So you're just stuck. You're going to die. Your entrails are out. You're still alive, but you're going to die. And there's nothing anybody can do for you. So this scourging that Pilate offers is very severe. It should have been okay with the crowd to say, well, okay, that's good. We'd like to see him beaten. Maybe that'll shut him up. He won't go around preaching anymore. He won't upset the Jewish apple cart any longer, and we could be satisfied with that. But no, they're not satisfied with that. They've had enough of Jesus, and they want to see him dead. They want to see him put away forever where he's no longer there to be worried about. Isn't it amazing? Isn't it amazing that this Jewish mob could coerce this experienced Roman official? I think it's amazing. Well, there's some historical reasons that don't really come out in the scriptures regarding why this would be in the case of Pilate. He had made some serious mistakes along the way as he governed Judea. That's his province. He has the governor's seat in Caesarea, not in Jerusalem, but he's in Jerusalem for this because it's Passover. And exactly why he's there, I don't know, but he is. And he has a history with the Jews wherein they're not really happy with him. Now, you would think that from a Roman perspective that would be meaningless, but you see, again, Rome's primary goal is two things: pay your taxes and do not create civil unrest. If you can maintain that order in the Roman Empire, they're going to leave you alone. They're not interested in just stirring up trouble. They want you left alone. They like it if it's the Pax Romana, the peaceful Rome, and you can help maintain that by behaving well. They will leave you alone. They don't care where you go to church. They don't care who you worship. They don't care what kind of clothing you wear. They don't care about anything you're doing as long as Rome is peaceful. You create a problem for that, and Rome's coming. Well, Pilate had ordered a garrison to be stationed in Jerusalem when he became governor of Judea. They didn't like that. And the reason they didn't like it is when he stationed the troops there, they carried these standards. I don't know if you've ever seen them in the movies. You've got these poles that stand up about 8 or 9 feet tall, and there's a T-top on it with an eagle or something else on the top above that, and a flag that hangs down from the T. And that's called the Roman standard. And on the standard, Pilate had ordered that Caesar's image be placed on the standard. Well, you can't do that in Jerusalem. You can't do that to the Jews because for them, that becomes deification of Caesar. It's an image. And at this time in history, Caesar was seen as God incarnate. That's how Caesar was to be. They would, if you were questionable in your loyalty to Rome, they would take you and examine you. And as long as you would burn incense and kneel before Caesar as a deity, they would let you go. Which happened to a lot of Christians after this period, wherein they were required to do that and they couldn't. But for the Jew, this was incredible. So they went to Caesarea. The Jews traveled to Caesarea to the governor's palace, and they entreated Pilate for 6 long days to take these standards down because they were idolatry. And Pilate refused. And then on the 6th day, he'd had enough of them, and he said, look, if you don't go home, I'm going to turn the troops loose on you, and they're going to kill you. Well, these Jews got down on their knees and pulled their cloaks back and bared their necks waiting for the sword, all of them. Well, this was even too much for Pilate, and he said, look, if these people are that serious about this idolatry question, we'll take the standards off. Because prior to Pilate, you see, the Jews had asked for this before, and the other governors had taken the standards off. So they had accommodated the Jews because they want the Pax Romana, the peaceful Rome. Pilate, for whatever reason, I don't know why. I mean, if you read Josephus regarding Pilate, Pilate's really not a real friendly guy. So it could well be that this was just Pilate's personality. I don't know. But he didn't refuse him after 6 days. and that they bared their necks and would take death rather than having these standards marched through Jerusalem. Pilate knows that if he messes this up with Jesus and the Jews, he could be dismissed officially by Rome, because Rome's not going to tolerate the civic unrest. So what do the Jews do? They're very shrewd here. I have to hand them credit for being politically savvy here. If you go to John 19, you see what they charge toward Pilate. They say, well, if you don't crucify Jesus, you're not Caesar's friend. Oh, well, that's it then. I mean, at that point, there's no way that Pilate could say, well, you know, I am Caesar's friend. You see, they have invoked something here that Pilate's going to pay attention to because he knows that Rome will pay attention to it. And so they are absolutely victimizing Pilate according to his past. That's a very important principle. They're almost blackmailing Pilate at this point in order to get him to do what they want him to do. You see, this is a powerful principle, I think, for you and for me. How often do we despoil our opportunity to do the right thing? How often, as followers of Jesus that we claim to be, do we despoil our ability to be followers of Jesus in a public way? We do something in a public way that despoils us, and now we're held accountable for it in the public forever. I mean, all you've got to do is look around and see how many things over the last 25 or 30 years you and I as believers have had to explain. I can't tell you, with the people with whom I correspond, how often I am confronted with this particular sin of the church and this particular sin of the church and this particular sin of the church. I'm rational enough to know that that doesn't represent the whole church. You can't take that which is pathological, some of these sinful things the church people are doing, and make them normative. But that doesn't matter to the person who just wants to condemn the church, you see. For them, it matters a lot. So Pilate has done something here in his past wherein he has ruined himself in his ability to hold firm with the Jews here and do the right thing. The right thing is just say, look guys, I'm sorry, but you can't bring Jesus here on these charges because they make no sense to me. Insurrection made sense. And so when they told Pilate, you're no friend of Caesar's if you release him, Pilate had to pay attention to that. And then it's fascinating too how Pilate and Herod, who hated each other prior to this, become friends over this whole thing because they're both in a kind of a conundrum. Both Herod and Pilate listen to these charges that are being brought to Jesus and they just say, what are you talking about, guys? None of this rises to a level of anything worthy of death. Doesn't even rise to the level of being imprisoned. Doesn't even rise to the level of a charge as far as we're concerned. But both of them, Pilate and Herod, are both spineless politicians who are concerned about their legacy with regard to their past, that they cannot escape. And the Jews know that. The Jewish mob that wants Jesus crucified knows that both of these guys have skeletons in their closets. So Pilate is stuck now between two immovable objects. John's gospel records just how conflicted Pilate was, and Matthew's gospel goes into even greater depth, that Pilate's wife actually wanted to release this man. Don't have anything to do with this man, with this Jewish teacher. She'd had a dream. And so I wonder about that dream myself. I wonder, I don't know this, there's no record of it that I could find. Josephus doesn't speak to it that I could locate. But I wonder if Pilate's wife actually became a follower of Jesus later. I mean, she was witness to all of these things, and she knew of the crucifixion, and then she probably heard the reports of Jesus being seen alive 3 days later. So you wonder if perhaps she became a believer, because that dream means something. That dream strikes me as almost a supernatural intervention by God in Pilate's wife's life. I don't know that, but it does seem that way. Pilate raided the temple treasury, another thing he did, and he did it out of a good turn of heart. He wanted to build an aqueduct in Judea for the Jewish people. He was looking at it saying, look, you guys need another aqueduct. Hezekiah's aqueduct is not sufficient. I want to add to it. But to secure the funds to build it, he raided the temple treasury. Well, you can't do that and expect that the Jewish people are going to celebrate the fact that now they've got a water supply when their temple's been violated in this way. Because you're not even supposed to be in there if you're not Jewish, right? So the Jews objected to that. Well, what did Pilate do in order to put down the objections? He had a bunch of plainclothes Roman soldiers beat the people away, beat them physically to get them away so that they could raid the temple treasury. So Pilate's not a popular politician with the Jews. And so here he is. He's got his wife telling him to stay away from this person. He's got Rome telling him in his head he knows that this person's innocent and has not done anything to deserve death or even punishment. He knows that if he doesn't make the right decision, the Jews might become uncivil and create a riot, and that Rome will hear about it, and he knows that these things can get him in trouble with Rome, and so he's stuck. He is stuck. The last straw, of course, in this is the mob itself. And you've got this group of Jewish people who are looking for their Messiah, ostensibly. I mean, it was known in Judea at this time in history that the Messiah was imminent. The coming of Messiah was imminent. This was the time in Jewish history prophetically that people were looking for him. But the mob mentality has taken over once again. And so it doesn't matter to them about the prophecies or anything else, or even the chance that this might be the Messiah. Primarily because he's not what we were expecting. We were expecting the military leader. Jesus isn't one of those. And the things that Jesus is doing and saying are upsetting the Sadducees, upsetting the Pharisees, upsetting the scribes, upsetting the Herodians, upsetting the Sanhedrin. So obviously he can't be the Messiah, right? So we need to get rid of him. What's odd about this to me is Barabbas, whose name, by the way, I don't know if you're aware of this, but Bar-Abbas means son of the Father. So the son of the Father is going to be, who's accused of insurrection for real by Rome, is going to be set free. And the real son of the Father is going to be crucified. Isn't that interesting how that works out that way? Pilate can see the riot developing. He sees the tension. He recognizes that he has to do something here, and it has to be pragmatically right. What does he do? He does the political thing. And he says, okay, I'll satisfy your request. What do I care about Jesus? He's just another one of these itinerant Jewish preachers. There's a bunch of them. So if you lose one of them, what does it matter? Even though his wife has talked to him, even though Pilate knows this case is empty of any real accusations, he's a good politician, and he knows that he's going to do the thing that makes his life as easy as possible in this setting where nothing is easy. He's confronted with this, you see. This has invaded his world, this whole dispute between Jesus and the Jews, and now he's got to be placed in the position of deciding this case. And so he decides for the politically expedient thing and says, okay, I'll give him to you to crucify him. You can have Barabbas as your person to be set free. But there's a missing ingredient there, isn't there? That is, there's a supernatural orchestration taking place here as well. Even though all of the pieces are fitted very carefully in this moment such that Jesus does go to the cross, it's not because of some political accident, or it's not because of some political machinery. It's because God is allowing the political machinery to do his bidding. These things must happen in the way that they are happening. Pilate is a modern. If ever there was a person in the scriptures who embodies our modern politician, it's Pilate. And he embodies our modern thinking in a way that you might not have thought about before. His skepticism as to what can really be said to be true. You know, in John's gospel, Jesus said, those who are of the truth, listen to me. And Pilate just waves him off and says, what is truth? That's a modern take on things today. That truth could even exist in the objective sense in such cases as this. But it does. It has to. If God exists, there has to be objective truth. You know, that's one of the things that so many philosophers from the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s of the postmodern bent, they knew that if they could get rid of what they called the transcendent signifier, that is God, then truth could be evaporated and truth could be whatever we made it to be. Well, Pilate predates that by 2,000 years. Here he is making decisions on the basis of the fact that he himself doesn't believe that there's anything that's objectively really true about the world. So what difference does it really make here from Pilate's point of view? This insignificant itinerant preacher, Jewish guy, the Jews weren't seen as anybody terribly important. In fact, they were seen as troublesome by Rome. If I execute him, what's the big deal? Heck, I could execute both of them. It wouldn't matter. From Pilate's point of view, that's all true. What's making the difference here is that Jesus is in Jerusalem for a purpose. Pilate's a career politician who wets his finger and sticks it up into the wind to see which way it's blowing, and then he makes his decisions based upon that. And he has this lazy assumption about truth. What is truth? There isn't any. Well, that's just lazy. And he uses that in this instance to keep from having to really deal with Jesus. But again, all of this is God doing his work behind the scenes. What I find fascinating about this, as I reflect on this text, and of course you could take the whole gospel and look at it this way, is that there's a sense here wherein, and it's the kind of times in which we live as well, wherein the consensus means everything. In other words, truth. What is truth? Well, truth is the consensus opinion. I've heard it said, what are morals? Morals are the consensus about what is moral. That's the objective morality that people look to and say, well, morals are objective. They're the consensus of what everybody thinks is moral. Well, you can extrapolate from that into truth and say, truth is the same thing. But if God exists, none of that is so. There actually is something that's absolutely true. And so I look at it and I think about people who, especially right now, I mean, if COVID has done anything for us, it's doing for us what 9/11 did for us 20 years ago. It's confronting us with our fragility and confronting us with our human mortality. Every human being knows they have to die. That's just the way it is. I know it, you know it. Well, is there anything after that? Most people walk around with, small children do. I bring this up at every funeral because it is so powerful for me. Small children walk through the world with the idea that they will just go on. The idea of non-being for a small child is inconceivable. And I tell you, as a 61-year-old, it's almost inconceivable for me. I want you to just stop as I'm speaking here and try to think in your own mind about what it is to not be. Can you even think it? Well, this idea of the unthinkable then lends people to think perhaps there's something after the death of the body. But the consensus says, no, you're just potting soil. Is that really a safe way to look at something like death? I don't think it is at all. You know, Jesus seems like a pretty trustworthy fellow to me. And this would be a great question to ask anybody who says, why should I think about death in this way? I'd say, well, this consensus of people here now says, when you're dead, you're just dead. Do you want to believe them? Or do you want to believe this really trustworthy guy who said you could have eternal life? That there's something about us that does go on, and it goes on for eternity. And its location in eternity matters greatly. And its location is linked to this person who is telling us that we will go on. Boy, all those pieces for me open up a different perspective for me, wherein what Jesus has said, what Jesus has done, who Jesus is, how that relates to the world in which I live becomes a very serious matter indeed. Unlike Pilate, who could just wave his hand and flip off and say, what is truth? The God of the universe says it really does matter. Jesus said it well. He said, do not fear those who kill the body. Don't worry about it, because after they've killed your body, they can't do anything else. Isn't it fascinating as we look around the world and we see these people killing somebody and then dragging the body through the streets as though somehow that matters? And throughout history, you see people doing that, desecrating corpses. And I'm thinking to myself, I'm a follower of Jesus. What does it matter if my corpse is desecrated? Jesus said it well. Those who can kill the body, when they're finished killing you, that's all they can do. Don't fear them. Fear the one who can do something with you after the body is dead. Him you need to pay attention to. I'll tell you, Jesus is trustworthy enough for me that I'm going to pay attention to that. And I hope that you will as well. Pilate is an example of somebody who listened to the wind and followed it and didn't in any way go with what he knew to be right. You and I have the opportunity to go a little further than Pilate, and we can stake our claim on what Jesus has said and done, what he's done on the cross, and all the claims that come along with it now become utterly true because he comes back from the grave to demonstrate the fact that everything he had said is actually the truth. There is a truth, and that is the truth. I don't know where everybody is today, but if I've said anything about which you've got questions for me, I'm available. You can call me, you can text me. I would love to hear from you if you do have questions. Thank you so much for your attention this Sunday on such a strange day, another strange Sunday. I hope they come to an end soon. If you don't mind, and you can join me if you like, I'd like to close in just a moment of prayer. Lord, I want to thank you for the fact that you've given us an anchor in history, an anchor in our own hearts, in our understanding of the fact that you are, in that inner witness that you give us. And you've given us an anchor, Lord, for our life in this troubled time with COVID, when everything seems upside down. That, Lord, you're still on the throne. You see all of this. You know what's going on. You know our fears. You don't reject us because we're fearful. And you accept us, Lord, and bring us that comfort, that hand on the shoulder that says, I'm still with you. I've still got you. So, Lord, as we go through the rest of this day, please burn in our hearts the truth of the fact that you have granted us an offer of eternal life. For those of us who have accepted that offer, Lord, bring us that comfort that only you can give. We thank you so much for this today. In Jesus' name, amen.